The Directory was the government of France during the penultimate stage of the French Revolution. Administered by a collective leadership of 5 directors, it operated following the Committee of Public Safety and preceding the Consulate. It lasted from November 2, 1795 until November 10, 1799, a period commonly known as the Directory era. It was overthrown by Napoleon. The Directory at first had some success in foreign policy, especially after Napoleon's conquests in Italy. It annexed Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine River, and set up satellite regimes in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and most of Italy. The conquered lands were forced to provide huge subsidies to the French treasury, which otherwise was bankrupt. On the domestic front, however, conditions went from bad to worse and the Directory responded with repression. The period was a time of economic depression in France, with famines and widespread distress following the crop failure of 1795. Inflation was raging as the paper money was worth less than 1% of his face value. There was a major civil war in the Vendée Copyright region. The army crushed it by massacring thousands of civilians, often by drowning. The government suppressed its critics, their clubs and their newspapers. It executed Gracchus Babeuf, the chief spokesman for the poor. The War of the First Coalition against Britain and its allies dragged on at great expense, and with an unpopular conscription of young men. In 1799 the enemies of France scored a series of major victories, pushing the French back to their borders. The bright spot seemingly was Napoleon's highly successful campaigns, but when he invaded Egypt, the British sank his fleet and his army became trapped, while the armies still in Europe suffered a series of defeats in 1799. The Directory had very little popular or elite support left. Napoleon returned to Paris and overthrew the Directory on November 9, 1799. Historians have generally been negative about the Directory. Palmer says, the Directory became a kind of ineffective dictatorship. It repudiated most of the assignats, paper money and the debt but failed to restore financial confidence or stability. Guerrilla activity flared up again in the Vendée Copyright and other parts of western France. The religious schism became more acute. The Directory took severe measures toward the refractory clergy, those who would not swear allegiance to the government. It was a government of self-interest rather than virtue, thus losing any claim on idealism. It never had a strong base of popular support. When elections were held, most of its candidates were defeated. Historians have been quite negative on the Directory's use of military force to overturn election returns that went against them. Blum al. argue, having by this coup d'état copyright act forfeited its claim to be a constitutional government, the Directory henceforth clung to power only by such illegal acts as purges and quashed elections. Overall its achievements were minor, though it did establish administrative procedures and financial reforms that worked out well when Napoleon started using them. Brown stresses the turn toward dictatorship and the failure of liberal democracy under the Directory, blaming it for chronic violence, ambivalent forms of justice, and repeated recourse to heavy-handed repression. Directoire style refers to the neoclassical styles in architecture, the decorative arts and high society fashions that flourished during the period. Origins. In the first half of 1794 during the Revolution, the new French Republic was convulsed in civil and foreign wars. On 9 May year 2, deputies in the National Convention delivered a counterstrike, arresting and executing Robespierre along with Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, Georges Couthon, and many others. Their removal from power, and the subsequent divergence of the revolution's course, is known historically as the Thermidorian reaction. The demand for change was so great, it necessitated a reformation of the entire system of government. The original constitution of Year I, now permanently discredited by its origin among Jacobins, was quickly replaced by a new document, the Constitution of Year III. This dissolved the National Convention and established a unique new governmental system for France, a bicameral legislature led by a 5-member Directoire executive. Constitution of Year III. Under this new constitution, qualified property holders elected 750 legislators, who divided themselves into the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. This bicameral legislature had a term of 3 years, with 1/3 of the members renewed every year. The ancients held a suspensory veto, but possessed no initiative in legislation. The constitution specified the executive as consisting of 5 directors, chosen by the ancients out of a list sent to them by the 500. One director faced retirement each year. Ministers for the various departments of state aided the directors. These ministers did not form a council or cabinet and had no general powers of government. The system made provision for the stringent control of all local authorities by the central government. Since the new constitution sought to create a separation of powers, the directors had no voice in legislation or taxation, nor could directors or ministers sit in either house. The law guaranteed freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of labor, but forbade armed assemblies and even public meetings of political societies. Only individuals or public authorities could tender petitions. From the beginning, however, circumstances restricted the free play of the Constitution. The convention had acquired so much unpopularity that, if its members had retired into private life, they would have risked the undoing of their work. There was still support for a more conservative government in western France, and others with political aims who had lost opportunities in the preceding years. The convention was also wary of the tumult that had ushered their rise to power. Therefore, a decree required that 2/3 of the first legislature must come from among the members of the convention. This had the effect of making it difficult and useless for voters to choose alternative candidates. When the constitution went before the primary assemblies, most electors held aloof, 1,057,000 voting for and 49,000 voting against it, and on September 23 it officially became law. Then all the parties which resented the limit upon freedom of election combined in Paris to rise in revolt. The government entrusted its defense to Barras, but on 13 Vendée copyright Meunier the young General Napoleon copyright on Bonaparte quelled attacks by large numbers of ill-equipped and ill-led Parisian insurgents with a few thousand regular troops and well-placed artillery. After the selection of the Council of the Ancients by lot, it remained to name the directors. For its own security the left resolved that all 5 must be old members of the convention and regicides who voted to execute King Louis XVI. The ancients chose Jean-François Section-Noir Roubel, Paul-François Section-Noir Jean-Nicolas, Vicomte de Barras, Louis-Marie de Lara copyright Vellier la copyright Poe, Lazare Nicolas Marguerite Carnot, and a permission François Section-Noir Le Tourneur. Notoriety of the Directory. With the establishment of the Directory, the revolution seemed on the verge of ending. The nation was tired of the violence of the Terror and needed time to recover. Wallach says that the Directory expected to operate a quiet, non-controversial government, but that was never possible because the Terror had left a dual legacy that made such normalcy impossible. On the one hand, massive disengagement, apathy, and cynicism about government. On the other hand, rancorous, violent hostility between the politically engaged minorities of Royalists and Jacobins, between whom the directorial moderates vainly attempted to navigate. Legality became the main casualty in this situation. The 4 years of the Directory were a time of chronic disquiet and the late atrocities had made goodwill between parties impossible. The same instinct of self-preservation which had led the members of the convention to claim so large a part in the new legislature and the whole of the Directory impelled them to keep their predominance. War was at the center of attention, not only for the survival of France but for the loot and forced payments into the French treasury. The supply of the army was taken out of the hands of the bureaucracy and given to private contractors, who made large fortunes through payoffs that highlighted the regime's tolerance of corruption. As a majority of the population wanted to be rid of them, the Directory could survive only by illegal means. They disregarded the terms of the Constitution, and, when the elections went against them, they used the army to suppress the winners. The army became increasingly powerful inside France. The state finances had been so thoroughly ruined that the government could not have met its expenses without the plunder and the tribute of foreign conquests. The Constitutional Party in the legislature desired toleration of the non-juring clergy, the repeal of the laws against the relatives of the A copyright migrant copyright, and some merciful discrimination toward the A copyright migrant copyrights themselves. the directors firmly opposed any compromises with monarchists. Babeuf's conspiracy. As the economy worsened, unrest grew. Babeuf organized his conspiracy of the equals. Babeuf had, since 1789, been drawn to the agrarian law, or sharing goods in common, as means of achieving economic equality. By the time of Robespierre's fall he had abandoned this as an impractical scheme and was moving towards a more complex plan of collective ownership and production. This, in essence, was still his ultimate aim when, in winter of 1795–96, he conspired with a group of former Jacobins, clubmen and terrorists to overthrow the Directory by force. The movement was organized in a series of concentric circles. There was an inner insurrectionary committee, composed of a small body of intimates who alone were fully informed of the conspiracy's aims. Beyond it, a group of sympathizers, ex-Jacobins and others, including Robespierre's old opponents, Amat and Lindit. And finally, on the fringe, the Paris militants who had been won over, reckoned by Babeuf at some 17,000 men. The plan was original and grievance was rife, but the sans-culottes, cowed and silenced since Prairial, failed to respond. The conspirators were betrayed by a police spy to Carnot, a director who was moving to the right. On the night of 23 to 24 Fructidor their partisans attempted to win over the soldiers of the camp of Grenelle. Carnot was aware of their plan and they were surprised by the cavalry. 131 were arrested and 30 shot out of hand. The principal Babeuf associates were brought to trial. Babeuf and Arthur Copyright were guillotined. War in the Vendée Copyright. In Vendée Copyright, peasants revolted against the French revolutionary government in 1793. They resented the changes imposed on the Roman Catholic Church by the civil constitution of the clergy and broke into open revolt in defiance of the revolutionary government's military conscription of young men into the army. This became a guerrilla war, known as the War in the Vendée Copyright. North of the Loire, similar revolts were started by the so-called Chouans. The revolt and its suppression, including both combat casualties and massacres and executions on both sides, are thought to have taken between 117,000 and 250,000 lives. Because of the extremely brutal forms that the Republican repression took in many places, certain historians such as Reynald Secher have called the event a genocide. This description has become popular in the mass media, but has largely been rejected by mainstream scholars. Furet concludes that the repression in the Vendée not only revealed massacre and destruction on an unprecedented scale but also a zeal so violent that it has bestowed as its legacy much of the region's identity. Facing local revolts and foreign invasions in both the east and west of the country, the most urgent government business was the war. On August 17, the convention voted for general conscription, the levée copyright en masse, which mobilized all citizens to serve as soldiers or suppliers in the war effort. Military successes. However, the Directory was sustained by the military successes of 1796. Hoche again suppressed the revolt in the Vendée Copyright. Bonaparte's victories in Italy more than compensated for the reverses of Jourdan and Moreau in Germany. The King of Sardinia made peace in May 1796, ceding Nice and Savoy to the French Republic and consenting to receive French garrisons in his Piedmontese fortresses. By the Treaty of San Ildefonso, concluded in August, Spain became the ally of France. In October 1796, the Kingdom of Naples made peace. Bonaparte finished the conquest of northern Italy and forced Austria to make the Treaty of Campo Formio, whereby the Emperor ceded Lombardy and the Austrian Netherlands to the French Republic in exchange for Venice and urged the Diet to surrender the lands beyond the Rhine. Notwithstanding the victory of Cape St. Vincent, the United Kingdom was brought into such extreme peril by the mutinies in its fleet that it offered to acknowledge the French conquest of the Netherlands and to restore the French colonies. The selfishness of the three directors threw away this golden opportunity. In March and April, the election of a new third of the councils had been held. It gave a majority to the Constitutional Party. Among the directors, the lot fell on Latourneur to retire, and he was succeeded by Arthur Copyright Lemy, an eminent diplomatist, who allied himself with Carnot. the political disabilities imposed upon the relatives of a copyright migrant copyrights were repealed. Priests who would declare their submission to the Republic were restored to their rights as citizens. It seemed likely that peace would be made and that moderate men would gain power. 18 Fructidor. When the Directory held its first elections in Germinal in order to find replacement for the first third of the deputies, including the so-called perpetuals members, the directorials were crushed in all but a dozen departments. Only 11 former deputies from the convention were re-elected, several of whom were royalists. Republican majority maintained by the two-thirds law disappeared. Royalists took control of the assemblies. General Pichegru presided over the 500 and Barber copyright Marbois over the ancients. They voted for the abolition of the law of 3 Brumaire for repressing refractory priests. Émigrés had started to return, taking advantage of being struck off the lists which made them liable to the death penalty under convention's laws. Meanwhile, emboldened by directorial passivity, the right resolved to emasculate it by depriving it of all its financial powers. The conflict between the Directory and the councils entered a crucial phase when majority of the directors made their mind and abandoned their stance of watchful caution. Number of resolute appointments were made, including Hoche to War Ministry. It was especially revealing since for 10 days the Sambre-et-Meuse army under Hoche's command had been marching on Paris. Barras, Rubel, and La Copyright Veliere La Copyright Po then sought help from the army. They accused the royalists of seeking to restore monarchy and to undo the work of the revolution. Hoche, then in command of the army of Sambre-et-Meuse, visited Paris and sent troops. Bonaparte sent General Augereau, who designed the coup d'état copyright tat. On 18 Fructidor year V, Paris was placed under a military occupation. There was no resistance, and a decree stated that all those who wished to bring about the re-establishment of the monarchy would be shot on the spot. The elections were annulled in 49 departments, 177 deputies were removed and 65 were sentenced to dry guillotine deportation to Guyana. 42 newspapers were suppressed and repressive measures against émigrés and priests were re-implemented. The councils were purged, the elections in 49 departments were cancelled, and many deputies and other men of note were arrested. Some of them, including Barber copyright Lemmy, Pichegru, Barber copyright Marbois and Lafond de Ladebat were deported to Cayenne. Carnot made good his escape. The 2 vacant places in the Directory were filled by Merlin de Douai and Nicolas Louis Frenet section de Neufchâteau. Then the government frankly returned to Jacobin methods. The law against the relatives of a copyright migrant copyrights was reenacted, and military tribunals were established to condemn any a copyright migrant copyrights court in France. The nonjuring priests were again persecuted. Many hundreds were either sent to Cayenne or imprisoned in the hulks of old ships. La Copyright Veliere La Copyright Po seized the opportunity to propagate his religion. Many churches were turned into theophilanthropic temples. The government strained its power to secure the recognition of the dark copyright Kadi as the day of public worship and the non-observance of Sunday. Liberty of the press ceased. Newspapers were confiscated and journalists were deported wholesale. It was proposed to banish from France all members of the old aristocracy. Although the proposal was dropped, they were all declared to be foreigners and were forced to obtain naturalization if they would enjoy the rights of other citizens. A formal bankruptcy of the state, the cancelling of 2/3 of the interest on the public debt, crowned the misgovernment of this disastrous time. 1798, in the spring of 1798, not only a new third of the legislature had to be chosen, but the places of the members expelled by the Revolution of Fructidor had to be filled. The Constitutional Party had been rendered helpless, and the mass of the electors were indifferent. However, among the Jacobins themselves, there had arisen an extreme party hostile to the directors. With the support of many who were not Jacobins but detested the government, it bade fair to gain a majority. Before the new deputies could take their seats, the directors forced through the councils the law of 22 Flora Copyright L Year 6, annulling or adjusting the elections in 30 departments and excluding 48 deputies by name. Even this coup d'état copyright tat did not secure harmony between the executive and the legislature. In the councils, the directors were loudly charged with corruption and misgovernment. The retirement of Section de Neufchâteau and the choice of Trilard as his successor made no difference in the position of the Directory. While France was thus inwardly convulsed, its rulers were doubly bound to husband the national strength and practice moderation towards other states. Since December 1797, a Congress had been sitting at Rastatt to regulate the future of Germany. That it should be brought to a successful conclusion was of the utmost importance for France. However, the directors were driven by self-interest to new adventures abroad. Bonaparte was resolved not to sink into obscurity, and the directors were anxious to keep him as far as possible from Paris. They, therefore, sanctioned the expedition to Egypt, which deprived the Republic of its best army and most renowned captain. Coveting the treasures of Bern, the directors sent Brune to invade Switzerland and remodel its constitution. In revenge for the murder of General Duphot, they sent Berthier to invade the Papal States and erect the Roman Republic. They also occupied and virtually annexed Piedmont. In all these countries, they organized such an effective pillage that the French became universally hated. As the armies were far below the strength required by the policy of unbounded conquest and rapine, the first permanent law of conscription was passed in the summer of 1798. The attempt to enforce it caused a revolt of the peasants in the Belgian departments. The priests were held responsible and some 8,000 were condemned to deportation en masse, although the much greater part escaped by the goodwill of the people. Few soldiers were obtained by the conscription, for the government was as weak as it was tyrannical. Under these circumstances, Horatio Nelson's victory of Aberca, which gave the British full command of the Mediterranean and isolated Bonaparte in Egypt, was the signal for a second coalition. Naples, Austria, Russia and Turkey joined Great Britain against France. Ferdinand IV of Naples, rashly taking the offensive before his allies were ready, was defeated and forced to seek a refuge in Sicily. Quasi-war with the United States, 1798–1799 . Tensions between the U.S. and France developed into the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval war. France complained the U.S. was ignoring the Treaty of Alliance that had brought the French into the Revolutionary War. The United States insisted on taking a neutral stance in the war between France and Britain. After the Jay Treaty with Britain went into effect in 1796, France began to side against the United States and by 1797 they had seized over 300 American merchant ships. Federalists favored Britain, while Jeffersonian Republicans favored France. Federalist President John Adams built up the U.S. Navy, finishing 3 frigates, approving funds to build 3 more, and sending diplomats to Paris to negotiate. They were insulted by Foreign Minister Talleyrand. The XYZ affair told Americans about the negotiations and angered American public opinion. The war was fought almost entirely at sea, mostly between privateers and merchant ships. In 1800 the Convention of 1800 ended the conflict. 1799, in January 1799, the French occupied Naples along with Toga and set up the Parthenopaean Republic. But the consequent dispersion of their weak forces only exposed them to greater peril. At home, the Directory was in a most critical position. In the elections of April 1799, a large number of Jacobins gained seats. A little later Rubel retired. It was imperative to fill his place with a man of ability and influence. The choice fell upon Sieyès, who had kept aloof from office and retained not only his immeasurable self-conceit but the respect of the public. Sieyès felt that the Directory had bankrupted its own reputation, and he intended to do far more than merely serve as a member of a board. He hoped to concentrate power in his own hands, to bridle the Jacobins, and to remodel the constitution. With the help of Barras, he proceeded to rid himself of the other directors. An irregularity having emerged in Trilard's election, he retired, and Gourhier took his place. Merlin de Douai and Laurent Copyright Vellier La Copyright Po were driven to resign in June 1799. Moulin and Ducos replaced them. The 3 new directors so lacked significance that they could give no trouble, but for the same reason they could give little service. such a government proved ill-fitted to cope with the dangers then gathering round France. The directors resolved on a French offensive in Germany. The French crossed the Rhine early in March, but Archduke Charles of Austria defeated them, first at Ostrach on March 23 and then at Stockach on March 25, 1799. Jourdan's army of the Danube withdrew to the Rhine under the command of Lee Corby, while Jourdan himself returned to Paris to plead for more and better soldiers. The Congress at Rastatt, which had sat for 15 months without actually accomplishing anything, broke in April, and Austrian hussars murdered the French envoys. In Italy, the Allies took the offensive with an army partly Austrian, partly Russian, under the command of the Russian Field Marshal Suvorov. After defeating Moreau at Cassano d'Odda on April 27, 1799, he occupied Milan and Turin. The puppet republics established by the French in Italy collapsed, and Suvorov defeated the French army on the Trebia as it retreated from Naples. Thus threatened with invasion on her German and Italian frontiers, France seemed disabled by anarchy within. The finances stood in the last distress. The anti-religious policy of the government kept many dark copyright departments on the verge of revolt. And commerce almost ground to a halt due to the decay of roads and the increase of bandits. The French lacked any real political freedom, yet also lacked the ease or security which enlightened despotism can bestow. The terrorists lifted their heads in the Council of 500. A law of hostages, which was really a new law of suspects, and a progressive income tax showed the temper of the majority. The Jacobin Club reopened and became once more the focus of disorder. The Jacobin press renewed the license of Ha copyright Bert and Marat. Never since the outbreak of the revolution had the public temper seemed so gloomy. In this extremity, CAS chose as Minister of Police the old terrorist Joseph Fouché Copyright, who best understood how to deal with his brethren. Fouché Copyright closed the Jacobin Club and deported a number of journalists. However, like his predecessors, CAS felt that for the revolution which he meditated, he must have the help of a soldier. As his man of action, he chose General Jalbert, one of the most distinguished among French officers. The Directory sent Jalbert to restore the fortunes of the war in Italy. At Novi, on August 15, 1799, he encountered Suvorov. He was killed at the outset of the battle and his men suffered defeat. After this disaster, the French held scarcely any territory south of the Alps save Genoa. The Russian and Austrian governments then agreed to drive the enemy out of Switzerland and to invade France from the east. At the same time, the joint forces of Great Britain and Russia assailed the Netherlands. However, the narrow views and conflicting interests of the members of the Second Coalition doomed it to failure like the first. Lack of coordination between Austrians and Russians, and Andra Copyright Massa Copyright Nars' victory at Saar I Quarterich stalled the invasion of Switzerland. In October, the British and the Russians had to evacuate the Netherlands. All immediate danger to France ended, but the issue of war remained in suspense. The directors had felt forced to recall Bonaparte from Egypt. He anticipated their order and on October 9, 1799 landed at Fra Copyright Jus. End of the Directory. The Directory and the French Revolution itself came to an end with the coup d'état copyright tat of 18 Brumaire in which General Napoleon copyright on Bonaparte overthrew the Directory and replaced it with a Consulate. In November 1799, France was suffering the effects of military reverses brought on by Bonaparte's adventurism in the Middle East. The looming threat of opportunistic invasion by the Second Coalition had provoked internal unrest, with Bonaparte stuck in Egypt. A return to Jacobinism seemed possible. The coup was first prepared by the Abba Copyright CAS, then one of the 5 directors. Bonaparte returned from Egypt a hero to the public despite his reverses. CAS believed he had found the general indispensable to his coup. However, Bonaparte promptly began a coup within the coup. Ultimately, the coup brought to power Bonaparte, not CAS. The plan was, through the use of troops conveniently arrayed around Paris, first to persuade the directors to resign, then to persuade the 2 councils to appoint a pliant commission to draw up a new constitution. On the morning of 18 Brumaire, Members of the Council of Ancient sympathetic to the coup warned their colleagues of a Jacobin conspiracy and persuaded them to relocate to St. Cloud, west of Paris. Bonaparte was charged with the safety of the two councils. 3 directors, including Sieyès himself, resigned, destroying quorum. However, the 2 Jacobin directors, Gourrier and Moulin, refused to resign. Moulin escaped, Gourrier was taken prisoner, and the 2 councils were not immediately intimidated and continued to meet. By the following day, the deputies had worked out that they were facing an attempted coup rather than being protected from a Jacobin rebellion. Faced with their recalcitrance, Bonaparte stormed into the chambers accompanied by a small escort of grenadiers. He met with heckling in both houses. He was first jostled, then outright assaulted. His brother Lucien, president of the council, called upon the grenadiers to defend their leader. Napoleon escaped, but only through the use of military force. Ultimately, military force also dispersed the legislature. The Directory was declared disbanded and a provisional consulate was set up, with Bonaparte, Sieyès and Ducos as consuls. The lack of reaction from the streets proved that the revolution was, indeed, over. In the words of the 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica, a shabby compound of brute force and imposture, the 18th Brumaire was nevertheless condoned, nay applauded, by the French nation. Weary of revolution, men sought no more than to be wisely and firmly governed. Resistance by Jacobin officeholders in the provinces was quickly crushed, 20 Jacobin legislators were exiled, and others were arrested. Bonaparte completed his coup within a coup by the adoption of a constitution under which the first consul, a position he was sure to hold, had greater power than the other 2. List of directors, Gottschalk says that except for Lazare Carnot, none of the members of the Directory was particularly able, and this proved to be a major weakness. The following table displays all directors and their dates of service, political parties, independent Cliccians Thermidorians. Presidency the Directory was officially led by a president, as stipulated by Article 141 of the Constitution of the Year 3. An entirely ceremonial post, the first presidency was held by Rubel, who was chosen by lot on November 2, 1795. The directors conducted their elections privately, and appointed a new president every 3 months. The last president was Gourrier, who resigned during Brumaire after his arrest by troops under the Bonapartist General Jean-Victor Marie Moreau. Ministers, the ministers under the Directory were. See also, Directoire style, Paris in the 18th century. References. Further reading, Chisholm, Hugh, ed. French Revolution, The Encyclopaedia Britannica 11. Cambridge University Press. Excerpts are included in this article. Black, Jeremy. From Louis XIV to Napoleon, The Fate of a Great Power. Routledge. ISBN 9780203006382. Church, Clive H. The Social Basis of the French Central Bureaucracy under the Directory 1795–1799, Past and Present No. 36, pages 59–72 in JSTOR, Doyle, William. The Oxford History of the French Revolution. Oxford University Press pages 318–40. ISBN 9780199252985. Furet, French Section War. The French Revolution, 1770–1814, 1770–1814. France, Blackwell Publishing. ISBN 0-631-20299-4. Goodwin, A. The French Executive Directoire a Revaluation. History 22.87 pp. 201–218. More favorable than most historians, Gottschalk, Louis. The Era of the French Revolution, pages 280–306, Hunt, Lynn, David Lansky and Paul Hansen. The Failure of the Liberal Republic in France, 1795–1799, The Road to Brumaire, Journal of Modern History 51 No. 4, pages 734 to 759 in JSTOR. Statistical profile of the different factions, Jamechill, Andrew. The Constitution of the Year 3 and the Persistence of Classical Republicanism. French Historical Studies 26 No. 3 pp. 399 to 435. Lefebvre, Georges. French Revolution from 1793 to 1799 pages 171 to 211, Lyon, E. Wilson. The Directory in the United States. American Historical Review 43 No. 3 pp. 514 to 532 in JSTOR, Lyon, Martin. France under the Directory excerpt and text search. The Standard Scholarly History, Palmer, Robert. At the Age of the Democratic Revolution, A Political History of Europe and America, 1760 1800 Vol. 2, The Struggle pages 211 62, 549-76, Lefebvre, Georges. Sobel, Albert. The Directory. London, Routledge and Kegan Paul. OCLC 668426465. Ross, Stephen T. The Military Strategy of the Directory, The Campaigns of 1799, French Historical Studies 5 No. 2 pages 170 187 in JSTOR, Rue de Copyright, George. The French Revolution. New York, Grove Weidenfeld. ISBN 0802132723. Sobel, Albert. The French Revolution, 1787 to 1799, From the Storming of the Bastille to Napoleon pages 477 547. Sutherland, D.M.G. The French Revolution and Empire, The Quest for a Civic Order 2nd ed. 2003, 430 pp. Excerpts and text search pages 263 301, Wiranov, Denis. Thermidorian Regime and the Directory, 1794-1799 215 p. Primary sources Stewart, John Hall, ed. A Documentary Survey of the French Revolution, pages 654 766.